I want to point out something going on specifically about black political power that I think Republicans did not expect. Because Republicans all over the country this year have taken the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court's dismantling of the Voting Rights Act, and they have used it to start a radical effort to constrict black voting power in the United States of America. In state after state, Republicans have been engaged in redrawing congressional districts, not just to entrench themselves in power, but specifically to take power away from minority voters and black voters in particular. Well, in response to that, we are now seeing in state after state that people have something to say about that, too. Take South Carolina. Earlier this year, Republican legislators in South Carolina, they were steaming ahead with a plan to dissolve the state's only majority black district, the seat held by the state's only black congressman, James Clyburn. That effort to box out James Clyburn drew protests, but it also drew voters in numbers that alarmed South Carolina Republicans. The first day of early voting in the South Carolina primary saw record-breaking turnout. Nearly 5 times more Democrats than Republicans cast ballots. Many of them said they were out at the polls to send a message, specifically to try to stop the redistricting plan to take away Clyburn's seat. And guess what happened next? That very same day, that first day of early voting, South Carolina Republicans got scared and scrapped their plan. The Republican state Senate leader warned his colleagues, quote, "People will vote when they're angry, and I think we've made some people mad." South Carolina. Also take a look at Georgia. Republicans in Georgia tried the same thing, tried drawing up new congressional districts to entrench themselves and to dilute and thereby deny black political power in the state of Georgia. As soon as the U.S. Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act, Georgia's governor called a special legislative session to redraw the state's maps. Well, when lawmakers arrived at the Capitol for that special session, this is what they were greeted with. The state Capitol packed to the gills with protesters who let the lawmakers know just what the people of Georgia thought about this plan. Georgia Republicans looked up at the balcony, looked up at the gallery, looked around them, looked at the fury they were about to unleash and said, okay, never mind. On second thought, maybe we will not try to redraw our maps to make our congressional delegation whiter and more permanent. Seems like that might be wildly unpopular. Now look at Tennessee. Tennessee is one of the southern states where Republicans did carry out their plan to dilute black political power. They broke up the state's single majority black district around Memphis, spreading black voters out into more rural, more conservative, whiter districts that stretch hundreds of miles from the city. And after the Republicans did that, then they decided that, then they realized they were going to have to learn what the people of Tennessee thought about it. Black leaders in Memphis in particular got to work. Pastors and organizers and activists and civic groups and unions held voter registration drives, organized rallies, worked the phones, knocked on doors, all in an effort to channel their neighbors' indignation and anger into action. In Memphis, the Reverend Earl Fisher of the Abyssinian Missionary Baptist Church said, quote, "I think in a lot of ways this awoke a sleeping giant. I don't think Republicans have anticipated or accounted for a mass mobilization effort." Well, sure enough, when Tennessee held its primary a few days ago on Thursday, Democratic voter turnout in Memphis's majority black Shelby County surged to the highest level in a decade. More than twice, more than double the turnout percentage for similar contests that were held just 2 years ago. The next day, Reverend Fisher told the Washington Post, quote, a night like last night lets you know it's not all in vain. Though he said he's not taking a victory lap. Black Tennessee Democrats will be up against long odds in November, these newly drawn congressional districts. But last week's turnout is a big first step and one that is rattling Republicans in Tennessee. Joining us now is the Reverend Earl Fisher, pastor at Abyssinian Missionary Baptist Church in Memphis. Reverend Fisher, it's a real honor to have you with us tonight. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
What did you and your colleagues, your fellow Tennessee residents, do to push voter turnout to those remarkable heights last week?
Well, I think it was a few things, and you mentioned most of them. I think the anger that people felt was palpable because they knew what the racist redistricting did was unjust. And so people wanted to respond to that. There's also some admiration. I think we have a candidate like Justin J. Pearson who has shown that he can appeal to people across a whole lot of different demographics, from age to race to gender. And I think people were motivated by him. And then also the activism of a lot of organizations who just decided we would try to target those low turnout precincts. And we were crunching numbers and, gathering people in rallies and trying to stay up to the wee hours of the night and trying to figure out how we can make up the margins.
It's going to be an uphill battle in November for Mr. Pearson, although you just described some of what I think he's known for, even nationally, in terms of how energizing his candidacy has been to his supporters, and how talented he is as a politician and as a leader. But that's going to be a plus 20 district or something. They've really gerrymandered that district to try to make it impenetrable to any Democratic candidate, let alone a black Democratic candidate. How do you feel like these efforts that you've shown so much effectiveness with thus far, how do you feel like they sustain over time or build over time? What kind of goals are you setting for yourselves and your fellow parishioners and residents?
Well, as you said, I think this is an opportunity to clap your hands but not run a victory lap. There is a longer runway now because we were responding to the immediacy of the moment when it first happened a couple of months ago. And now after this structure test that we could call a primary, you see where there may be some weak spots and you want to try to lean in and put a little bit more elbow grease in those spaces. But we still have a short window of time when you look at November. And so hopefully those candidates who were running in the primary who didn't win can throw their weight behind the candidate who did win. And those of us who have networks and congregations and community members can do all we can to make sure that we are educating our people on the issues, empowering them so that they feel strong when they come out, and then doing all we can to translate registration and education into voter turnout.
Reverend Fisher, I want to ask you just sort of a bigger question about this. I feel like sort of a moral cornerstone of this country when we talk about who we are and what kind of a journey we've been through in this country. We talk about not just the civil rights movement broadly, but the Voting Rights Act in particular and what it took to get the Voting Rights Act. And as the conservative-dominated Supreme Court essentially washed away the legislative protections, the legal protections of the Voting Rights Act, and as Republicans responded instantly to try to eliminate black political power everywhere they could, particularly all over the South, I feel like it was greeted with a lot of, consternation and worry, but not much work, especially on the part of the National Democratic Party, white liberal Democrats. I feel like people are sort of worried and sad about it, but not doing much to try to fix it. Whereas what you and your colleagues are doing is the work. What could be done, if anything, nationwide, and for people watching this across the country right now, to support more practical work to try to save black political power of the kind you and your colleagues are doing?
Well, the last thing people should do is just surrender. And I think that's what you saw us do after the verdict was in, whether it was the Calais verdict or whether it was what they did at the State House when they cracked the district. So instead of just throwing up your hands and surrendering, the first thing I started to do was just look at where some opportunities were. And one of the things I found out, Rachel, is that even in the state of Tennessee, 48% of voters would vote in patterns that are consistent with independent voters. Only 33% of voters would identify properly as Republicans. So that means that there was some opportunity there. Then you look at some of these counties where a lot of people just hadn't been out and done a lot of organizing. So that was another opportunity there. So I don't think that they calculated the moral force of black leadership and our capacity to motivate our people and to allow them to see a vision of what's possible, even when the odds are stacked against them. I know a little something about history, and then there have been situations that have been similar to this where we came out on top. And I think this could very well be one of them. I'm not lost on the magnitude or the enormity of the task right here. It is a big thing. And, if we do lose, it won't be because I or my colleagues pulled any punches. We'll do all we can all across the state. And I believe people all across the country can support. And sometimes that means sending your people this way. Sometimes it means sending money. Sometimes it means raising your voice. Everybody can make a phone call. Everybody can send a text message or share a social media post or something like that. So the more light that we shine on the darkness here, I think the better our opportunity come November.
Couldn't put it better myself. Beautifully put. The antidote to despair is not worry. The antidote to despair is action, is organizing.